Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? Hearing none on this vote, the yeas are 38, the nays are 60. Under the previous order requiring 60 votes for the adoption of this amendment, the amendment is not agreed to.
Madam President, I move.
The senator from Wisconsin.
I move to reconsider the vote by which the bill was passed.
Without objection. The senator from Missouri.
Madam President, I move
Without
to lay
objection, the motion is tabled.
I'll move to lay the motion on the table.
Without objection. There will now be 2 minutes evenly divided on Amendment 763.
Madam President.
The senator from South Carolina.
Madam President, 3 million Americans use over-the-counter inhalers to control asthma and other respiratory problems. The EPA 3 years ago came out with a ruling that bans these over-the-counter inhalers. That takes effect this January.
Madam President, I do not think the Senate is in order. This is a very important amendment. I have a bill on this amendment, which is the same thing. I would ask for regular order.
The Senate will be in order. The senator from South Carolina.
Thank you, Madam President. The EPA has banned these inhalers even though they've acknowledged negligible impact on the environment. My amendment just keeps this rule from going into to effect until the manufacturer can complete its work with FDA to change its propellant. So let's allow Americans to continue their quality of life while we solve the problem. We don't need to do that this January. It will be solved without the FDA enforcing this rule. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Madam President.
The senator from California.
Senate is not in order. Colleagues, this amendment affects the ability of people with asthma to purchase an inhaler that works. And the American Lung Association opposes this amendment. The American Thoracic Society, which is the expert, these are the experts on anything to do with respiratory diseases. 150,000 doctors oppose this amendment. I'm perplexed by it because the reason we want to get away from these CFCs is because Ronald Reagan signed the treaty to do away with them, and George W. Bush passed the rule to do away with them. So in behalf of the people who depend on inhalers that work right, that don't use CFCs, I hope we'll stand with the Lung Association and the 150,000 doctors of the Thoracic Society. I hope we'll vote this down.
Madam President, how much time do I have left?
18 seconds.
Certainly there are many doctors who want folks to come in and get prescriptions. There are many manufacturers who make prescription drugs. But let 3 million Americans access these inhalers. They do not cause any problems with the environment. The EPA has recognized it's negligible, and the manufacturer will have this worked out over the next few years.
The senator's time has expired.
Thank you, Madam President.
Is there a sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Sure. Yeah. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Dement. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Thanks. He said no. Mr. Kerry, Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landry, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner. Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Corker, Dement, Graham, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Kirk, Lugar, Moran, Murkowski, Nelson of Nebraska, Paul, Roberts, Rubio, Sessions, Shelby, and Vitter. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Kyle, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Akaka, Begich, Blumenthal, Boxer, Brown of Massachusetts, Brown of Ohio, Cantwell, Carper, Collins, Conrad, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Harkin, Inouye, Johnson of South Dakota, Kerry, Klobuchar, Cole, Landrieu, Lautenberg, Manchin, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murray, Pryor, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schumer, Shaheen, Tester, Udall of New Mexico, Webb, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of Colorado, no. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, no. Mrs. Hagan. Mrs. Hagan, no. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, no. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Bingaman, no. Ms. Snow. Ms. Snow, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lieberman, no. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada, no. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Nelson of Florida, no. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, no. Mrs. Hutchison. Mrs. Hutchison, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Levin.
I'm sorry. I thought you said his name.
Mr. Levin, no.
Thanks, Gary. Sorry, I thought you said his name.
Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, no.
Senators in the chamber wishing to vote or change their vote? Hearing none. On this vote, the yeas are 44, the nays are 54. The amendment has failed.
Move to reconsider, lay that on the table. Madam President.
Without objection. So
Madam
ordered.
President,
the Majority Leader.
it's my understanding on the next vote that's scheduled, the Crapo amendment, that Senator Crapo and Senator Stabenow wish to enter into a colloquy, and I ask unanimous consent they both be given 2 minutes to explain what this is all about.
Without objection.
Madam President.
The Senator from Idaho.
Thank you, Madam President. As the leader has indicated, I will withdraw this amendment at the conclusion of this colloquy, but I wanted to make sure we understand what the amendment does. This amendment prohibits any funds from being used by the CFTC to promulgate any final rules under Title VII until the agency substantiates that those rules are economically beneficial, adheres to congressional intent to provide end users with a clear exemption from margin requirements, and sets clear bounds on the overseas application of derivatives requirements. While there is not yet a bipartisan agreement to go forward with this amendment at this time, there is a bipartisan list of issues that regulators need to address. They need to protect end users from burdensome margin requirements. Margin requirements proposed by regulators currently ignore the clear intent of Congress not to impose them on end users. They need to limit the extraterritorial application of Title VII per congressional intent in Sections 722 and 764. This is also being addressed in the House of Representatives. They need to encourage greater coordination and harmonization between the SEC, the CFTC, and international regulators to seek broad harmonization of cross-border issues. And they need to ensure that the new rules are subject to robust and quantitative assessment of costs and benefits. The regulators involved in our rulemaking process should know that Congress is going to closely monitor how they proceed, and we expect a change in course. If we don't get that change in course, then we'll need to return to this kind of legislation. I want to thank Senator Stabenow for working with me. She and many other senators across the aisle have indicated a willingness to help try to achieve these objectives and to work together to try to make this happen. And so with that, I yield my time to Senator Stabenow.
Senator from Michigan.
Thank you, Madam President. First, I want to thank my colleague for raising issues of great importance to all of us. Financial regulatory reform is critically important for our country moving forward, and Senator Crapo and I have talked earlier about his amendment. We have a number of areas in which we share concern, and I've committed to work with him on these issues. First and foremost, I agree with my friend from Idaho that we need to protect our manufacturers, our rural co-ops, energy providers, other companies that use financial products to manage their legitimate business risks. These end users didn't cause the financial crisis, and so when we passed Wall Street reform, we included protections for them. We've held several hearings in the Agriculture Committee to reinforce the regulators, to reinforce to them that manufacturers and others need to be protected. We'll continue to do that oversight. We certainly agree that as new rules are written, we need to make sure they are open and there's a transparent process. I believe the Commodity Futures Trading Commission has created, in fact, an open and transparent process and has worked to improve that process over time. They've held roundtables, sought public comment, are making changes based on those comments to ensure that the rules work. But it's important that we continue to have oversight, work with the agencies to make sure the rules are right. We will be holding another oversight hearing in the next few weeks, and it's important that we continue to urge the regulators to be mindful of the effects on American businesses. But it's also important to remember that we passed reform because of the serious consequences of the financial crisis. Millions of families who lost their homes, countless businesses shuttered, 8 million jobs lost. So that we need to ensure that the rules are written in a way that creates incentives to be able to keep jobs here, for banks not to move their operations overseas, to avoid oversight, and we share that concern. We definitely need to get the rules right and keep the jobs here in America. And as I've told my colleague, will continue to work with him on these important issues. Thank you.
The Senator from Idaho.
Thank you, Madam President. With that understanding, I first ask that our full statements for each of us be placed in the record at this time.
Without objection.
And I would ask unanimous consent that my amendment be withdrawn.
Without objection.
Madam President, I have a unanimous consent request.
Madam President,
The Majority Leader.
I would hope that everyone just listened to and watched the exemplary way of ridding ourselves of some of these amendments. We have 2 more amendments. It would be great if we didn't have to vote on those. I think that the explanation given by the 2 senators is an indication that progress can be made even without a vote.
Madam President,
The Senator from Michigan.
I ask unanimous consent that a statement of mine relative to the Crapo amendment be inserted in the record.
Without objection. There are now 2 minutes evenly divided. Or maybe none.
I ask unanimous consent that the amendment that was just called is not ripe for debate here. I would ask consent that we move to the Coburn Amendment.
Without objection. The Senator from Oklahoma.
Madam President, this is a straightforward amendment on a program that fails 70% of the time. We spend $35 million a year. It has an abject failure rate. Only 30% of it results in anything positive happening. 75% of the time it does not. The Obama administration and the Bush administration thought this program should be canceled. I reserve the balance of my time.
Madam President.
The Senator from Maine.
Madam President,
Only $6 million is provided for this program, but it makes a big difference for small rural communities that are struggling to provide air service. Air service is so important to jobs and economic development in these regions. It's important to note that there is a requirement for state and local participation in these programs, and that there's a high demand. Nearly 300 communities across this country have benefited from this program since established. Senator Hutchinson has offered to tighten up the program to meet the concerns of the senator from Oklahoma. I urge my colleagues to reject the amendment. This is really critical to small rural communities.
Madam President.
The senator from Oklahoma.
What the senator from Maine just said is $4.2 million is going to be unsuccessful. 2.8 might be. The fact is that with a $1.3 trillion deficit, a $15 trillion debt, we can't continue to do this no matter how great it sounds when it fails 70% of the time. I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. There is. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus. Mr. Beckidge, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown in Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. DeMint, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Carey. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle.
You're supposed to be in the chair. Okay. It's all my fault.
Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Nelson, Nebraska. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer. Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Bennett, Coates, Coburn, Corker, Cornyn, DeMint, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kyle, Lee, Lieberman, McCaskill, Paul, Rubio, Sessions, Shaheen, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Udall of Colorado, and Vitter. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, aye. Mr. Crapo? Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Heller, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Senators voting at the White House. Senators voting in the negative. Akaka, Baucus, Beckidge, Bingaman, Blumenthal, Blunt, Boxer, Brown of Ohio, Cantwell, Cochran, Collins, Conrad, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hutchison, Inouye, Johnson of South Dakota, Kerry, Kirk, Klobuchar, Cole, Landrieu, Lautenberg, Leahy, Levin, Lugar, Manchin, Menendez, Moran, Murray, Nelson, Nebraska, Nelson of Florida, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schumer, Tester, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Webb, Whitehouse, and Wicker. Ms. Snow, no. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Hoeven, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Wyden? Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Merkley? Mr. Merkley, no. Mrs. Hagan, no. Mr. Harkin, no. Mr. Pryor, no. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Roberts, no. Ms. Stabenow, no. Mr. Portman, aye. Ms. Mikulski? Ms. Mikulski, no. Mr. Cardin, no.
No, I didn't. Has every member voted? Does any member wish to change his or her vote? On this amendment, the ayes are 41, the nays are 57. The amendment is not agreed to. Okay. Senator from Utah.
I have a motion to recommit at the table.
The motion is pending, and the senator has 1 minute.
Mr. President, I filed this motion to recommit H.R. 2112 with instructions to send this minibus back to the Committee on Appropriations for one simple reason. It spends more for the same set of expenditures in fiscal year 2012 than it did in 2011, to the tune of about $10 billion. I understand that there are reasons for this excess. I understand that when we look at individual components of the 2012 provision, there may be some cuts in there. But the overall picture, the entire pie, is about $10 billion more than what we had in FY 2011. Unless we can be open and transparent with the American people and acknowledge the fact that we are, in fact, spending more, I think this is a problem. We've got to get this fiscal house in order, and this is how it's perpetuated when we claim that we're cutting when we're in fact spending more. That's the reason for this motion to commit, and I urge my colleagues to support it.
The senator from Hawaii.
This motion to recommit purports to set discretionary spending in FY 2011 levels for these three bills. But, Mr. President, this motion is extremely misleading because increased mandatory spending included in the three bills, they're not touching that. Agriculture alone would see a $7 billion cut due to increases in mandatory programs. If you include emergency disaster relief, it will force an additional cut of $3.2 billion. Mr. President, the measure before us is within our 302B allocation, scored by the CBO and the Senate Budget Committee, and it meets every requirement of the Budget Control Act. I strongly urge a no vote.
As for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. There is. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Sir, I did. Sir. Mr. Dement. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kerry. Gotcha. Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu,
Oops, I didn't hit it.
Mr. Lautenberg, Durbin, Cantwell.
Oh, okay, you did that. Sorry, Mary.
That's all right. Sure. Ms. Landry, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island,
So are you going to then voice vote? Yeah. Voice vote the amendment of the amendment, or roll call vote on the bill?
Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch,
Yeah.
Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio,
But you still have
Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer,
the amended as amended. Again, was it amended anymore?
Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb,
Okay, got you. I'm sorry, I'm thinking wrong.
Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Ayotte, Barrasso, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Corker, Crapo, Dement, Enzi, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Hoven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Kirk, Lee, Lugar, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Roberts, Sessions, Snow, Thune, and Vitter. Senators voting in the negative: Akaka, Alexander, Begich, Bingaman, Blunt, Brown of Massachusetts, Cantwell, Cardin, Cochran, Collins, Conrad, Coons, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Hutchison, Inouye, Johnson of South Dakota, Klobuchar, Cole, Landrieu, Manchin, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murray, Nelson of Nebraska, Nelson of Florida, Reed of Nevada, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Webb, Whitehouse, and Wyden. Mr. Kerry, no. Mr. Bennett, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mrs. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer, no. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller, aye. Ms. Murkowski, no. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Kyle, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, no. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown of Ohio, no. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Lautenberg, no. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, no. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Baucus, no. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lieberman, no. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Pryor, no.
Has every member voted? Does any member wish to change his or her vote? On this motion, the motion to recommit has failed.
Mr. President, right here, Mr. President. I move to reconsider the vote by which the bill was passed.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I raise a germaneness point of order against the pending amendment number 764.
The point of order is sustained, and the amendment falls. Under the previous order, the remaining covert amendments are withdrawn. The clerk will read the bill for the third time.
Counter number 155, H.R. 2112, an act making appropriations for agriculture, rural development, Food and Drug Administration, and related agencies programs for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2012, and for other purposes.
The question is on the passage of a bill as amended. Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus.
Aye.
Mr. Beckidge, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Paul.
Every other
Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Dement. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. I look forward to that. Comedy of errors.
Yeah. I've got to say he's an idiot.
Yeah.
I have you as I. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inouye. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johanns. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Carey. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Manchin. Passage. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson, Nebraska. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Snow. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester.
Yes.
Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall of Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner.
Aye.
Mr. Webb. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Ms. Mikulski. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. McCaskill. Senators voting in the affirmative. Senators voting in the affirmative: Akaka, Alexander, Baucus, Beckidge, Bingaman, Blumenthal, Blunt, Boxer, Brown of Massachusetts, Brown of Ohio, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Cochran, Collins, Conrad, Coons, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Graham, Hagan, Hoeven, Hutchison, Inouye, Johans, Johnson of South Dakota, Kerry, Kirk, Klobuchar, Cole, Landrieu, Lautenberg, Leahy, Levin, Lieberman, Manchin, McCaskill, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Moran, Murkowski, Murray, Nelson, Nebraska, Nelson of Florida, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Roberts, Sanders, Schumer, Shaheen, Shelby, Snow, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Webb, Whitehouse, Wicker, and Wyden. Mr. Kyle. Mr. Kyle. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Ayotte, Barrasso, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, DeMint, Enzi, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kyle, Lee, Lugar, McConnell, Paul, Risch, Rubio, Sessions, Thune, Toomey, and Vitter.